everyone, welcome to another live stream. I know it's been a while since I've done a live stream, and I put out a thread on Twitter just a few days ago to get feedback from you all on what you'd like to hear more about, what you'd like to see me talk about, and have a tweet here. Shout out to Felipe for putting out this question. Basically, how do I use getStaticProps, get server-side props for fetching data? And really, how do they fit together inside of a Next.js application? And today you're in luck because I'm going to talk about all the different ways to do this. And it's a little different from the normal videos that I make because I actually have a slide deck because of a talk that I'm giving here very soon. So you'll have some good images to go along with it as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to pull up this slide deck. Hey to everyone in the chat. Thanks for joining live. Appreciate you all joining. Feel free to throw any questions out as I go through here. I'm going to talk through some of these slides, and then I'll back out and I'll check the chat and see if you guys have any questions. So I also want to kick this off by doing a little introduction to Next.js because there might be some people joining live who haven't used it before or who subscribe to my channel for other videos, and they're just trying to figure out what I'm talking about today. So we're going to do a quick little introduction into Next.js, talk about Vercel just a little bit, and then we'll dive into how to do data fetching in Next.js. So if you've never heard of Next.js, it's totally okay. It is a React framework for building production applications, and it includes a lot of things that you probably need to use in your React applications by default with an opinionated set of tools that allows you to extend and customize those and override those as you see fit. So things like routing, file system-based routes are included with Next Router, image optimization through Next Image, which will automatically resize your images, serve them in modern formats, and ensure that you have great performance on your website. That's all included in the framework. React Fast Refresh for an amazing developer experience. Static assets. All you have to do is just drop a file in your public folder, and it's available to be served for your application. Built-in CSS support, Sass support. It's easy to use things like Tailwind if you'd like. You can even kind of merge your front-end and back-end worlds by using API routes by just making a new file at something like pages API user and then exporting a function that will be a serverless function. There's even things like internationalized routing and TypeScript support, and a really interesting one too that a lot of people might not realize is code splitting and bundling. So if I visit the index route of my application, we're only serving up the JavaScript for that route. And if I go to the About page, for example, and there's an error there, that won't affect the uptime of my index page. So not only is it more performant, but it's also resilient for errors. So that's Next.js, and it's been going pretty quickly over the last couple of years. It's now the most popular way to build React applications, and it's being used by a lot of small to medium to large size businesses and all the way into the enterprise. And the company that I work at is called Vercel, and I'm a solutions architect there. And we are the easiest way to deploy your Next.js application. And kind of our mantra is develop, preview, ship. So you start out with this Next.js application, these building blocks of React components, and you build your application locally. Then you push it up to a Git branch. You're able to preview your changes and get this live deployed URL that you can collaborate with stakeholders. Then you merge it and you ship it instantly to production to Vercel's Global Edge Network, which takes care of all the hard things for you, like cache invalidation and SSL encryption and asset compression, all those things, DNS, right? Nobody likes to mess with DNS. Vercel takes care of all that stuff for you and makes it really easy for you to ship, hobby projects all the way to enterprise sites. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about Next.js and what I do. The focus on today and what I want to talk about is how to do different data fetching methods with Next.js. And really it starts with just talking about the most simple Next.js application. So all it takes to make a Next.js application is to do npx create next app, or you could install React DOM, and Next individually, and then making a new file inside the pages directory. That sets up a new route automatically for you. And when you export a React component, that is all it takes to build your first Next.js application. So for example, here we have an About page with a very simple About React component. It gets exported, and then you can serve that up at localhost 3000/about. Now, what I want to talk about today are client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static site generation, and then as a bonus, incremental static regeneration. You've probably heard of some of these. You might be confused on how some of these work, how they fit together, how you can do them all with Next.js. And I'm here today to explain this and answer all your questions in the chat. So as I'm going through here, feel free to throw out questions and I'll make sure I get them answered. The first concept to understand with Next.js is pre-rendering. So if you think about a plain React.js application, there's no pre-rendering. And that initial application, there is nothing rendered. So if you are trying to visit a React application that has a really large bundle on a very, very slow internet connection, you might see a flash of white on the page where you're waiting for that JavaScript to load. And then after that JavaScript loads, there's this hydration period where the React components are initialized and the app becomes interactive. Now, with Next.js, you're actually using pre-rendering. So instead, the server serves up this initial HTML, and that's displayed on the initial load, which leads to a faster time to first byte, which is a fancy way of saying better performance. That's a core web vital, by the way, which we can get into more later. But then after the JavaScript loads, that application is hydrated, those React components are initialized, and it becomes available. And now you can do things like client-side navigation with your link components. I'm just going to quickly back out, check the chat. Awesome. Really nice to meet everybody who's joining in. Thank you so much for joining live. I haven't figured out a good way to do a keynote presentation and not have it take up my other screen. So I had to back out a full screen to see it, but just want to make sure that everything's going great. So I'll jump right back into this. So static generation, right? The HTML gets generated at build time and then reused for every request. So next build is the command that you use to build your application for production. When that happens, this HTML gets generated and then it's reused for every request. So if I generate my website and I go to my index route, my root route, every time the user hits that route, it's hitting a cache file, like if it's deployed on Vercel, and that is reused for every request. It's just static HTML. But there's really two different types of static generation in Next.js, and that's without data and with data. So if you think about the example we talked about earlier, that was the very simple about page, right? Simple React component. There's no external data fetching happening. When you run next build and that HTML is generated, we don't need to talk to any APIs. This component then just gets rendered down to an HTML file that you can serve up in your application. And that's without data. Now, probably more common is with data. So let's say that you have a bunch of different products for your e-commerce site. At build time, when you run next build, it's going to talk to some external data source. It's going to fetch some images, some text. And then after that promise resolves, after that asynchronous function happens, then this HTML gets generated. And now you have your site generated with data from some external source like a CMS or some headless API. So let's take a look at an actual code example here. And really the thing to focus in on is getStaticProps. This is the magic function that allows you to do static site generation. So inside of our page, if we export this function, this asynchronous function, we can call some API, for example, products, get back some JSON. And then when we return those props, that's actually forwarded to our React component. And then if you see, we're just structuring products from the props, and then we can iterate over those to list out all the different products for our e-commerce site. Now, the really cool thing about this is that happens at build time, but the magic of incremental static regeneration is that we can also make it happen at request time. And I've seen people get tripped up by this, so we can talk about a really quick example. Here, we're specifying revalidate of 60 seconds. So if I visit my site, my list of my products, and it's within those first 60 seconds, I'm going to see that static HTML that was generated at build time. After 60 seconds, the next person who visits that site, they see a stale version of the site, right? We said after 60 seconds, that content is stale. And just a side note, this is based on the cache control stale while revalidate HTTP header. So then in the background, what happens is we talk to our server, we call getStaticProps, we say, hey, this is stale. I need the newest version of that content. And assuming that that call is successful, what it does is it invalidates the cache and it updates it with the newest version of the page. So now the next person who comes to the site sees the most updated content. And I have a really great example of this here. So it's using GitHub issues and leaving reactions. And when you leave a heart or you leave a smile on this, you see that when we go back and we refresh, nothing changes because it's stale. But then on the second refresh, that request had went to the server, generated the new content, and then it updates our static page. So this kind of allows you to merge the world of static at build time and static at request time and prevent you from having to do a full rebuild of your application, and instead kind of merge some of the benefits that you would get from server-side rendering, which I'll talk about here very shortly. The next piece with static site generation is the actual paths in your application. So if you have a bunch of different posts, right, you need a route in your application for every single post. So when you run next build, you need to go fetch some data and retrieve all of the different posts that you have so that you can generate a route for each one. And we can do this using getStaticPaths. It's a very similar idea to getStaticProps. We fetch from some API or some data source. It could be even your local file system. And then we take that, we create this list of paths that we want to make available to our application. And then you see we also have a fallback of false. And what this says is, if I try to go to a route that doesn't exist, somebody just spams some random letters, that's going to throw a 404 and that page is not available. Now there's also true and blocking, and those are in the documentation if you want to learn a little bit more about those, or we can talk about them if anyone has any questions on those. Now we can talk about server-side rendering. So with this, that HTML gets generated on every request. So this is when you have really dynamic content that needs to be fresh at every request. Think about something like a Facebook news feed, something that has very personalized content. Maybe it has experiments or A/B testing being ran on it. You want to make sure that when that request happens in a blocking manner, it's going out, fetching data about your users or your A/B tests or whatever, and then it's actually rendering that HTML. So it's blocking until that resolves and it gets that HTML back from the server. So an example of this, if we focus in on get server-side props, very similar in structure to get static props. We fetch our API, we return them as props for the different products, and we return those up to our component. So similar in theory in the implementation, but it depends on your use case for when you would want to use one over the other. The final one that I want to bring up and talk about is static generation without data, but then you're doing data fetching on the client side. So I know that sounds kind of confusing, but I'll give a tangible example here that will make it hopefully make sense. So on the right, you see I have the Vercel dashboard, and it's in a loading state right now. And we're serving up this loading skeleton. So this is actually being pre-rendered from the server. So you will see this on your initial load. So when you run next build, this gets rendered to HTML. And then when the JavaScript loads on the client side, we're able to fetch some external data like our projects and our deployments and information about our user. And then we populate the rest of the page and we fill out this skeleton with real data. And at Vercel, we've made a handy library called SWR that helps you do this. It's a React hook for data fetching. So if we focus in here a little bit on this example, you see that if there's no data, we render that loading state or that skeleton. And this is what happens when we pre-render on the server. But then on the client side, when this hydrates, we say, all right, we want to talk to our API and fetch information about our user. This could be an API route in your application. It could be an external API. It could be REST. It could be GraphQL. It could return JSON. It's whatever you want. And then when we get that back, if that's successful, then we say, all right, let's render out the name of this person by accessing that data object. So this is a really good approach to allow you to have a low time to first byte by serving that markup from the server, and just a really good user experience too, because they see something initially, there's a nice loading screen. And especially if you're making a lot of different requests, like on the dashboard page, right? You have to fetch a lot of data. You wouldn't want all of those requests to be blocking and prevent the user from seeing, your screen and giving that perception that there was a bad user experience. But the best part about all of this, and that I really want to drive this point home, is that Next is a hybrid framework. And what that means is that we get to choose on a per page basis which one of these different data fetching strategies that I talked about that we want to use. So our index page, right, our marketing pages, they might be statically generated with no data fetching. They're just some markup, and that's all that we need. We might have like a newsfeed style page like Facebook, and we want that to be server rendered because it has personalized content that needs to be unique and available at every request. But then we also might have our blogs, and we might want to statically generate all of our blog pages. They talk to some CMS, and then they generate out, X number of different blog posts. And you can do all of that within the bounds of the framework without having to leave and have, a separate blog site, or leave and have a separate dynamic app that does something else. I think that's one of the most interesting and most exciting parts about Next.js for me, and personally what I really enjoy using it for. So those are just the quick slides that I had that will hopefully kind of paint the bigger picture. I'm going to go back and take a look at some of your questions in the chat and hopefully be able to answer some questions that you have. Yes, this live session will be uploaded on my YouTube after. So I believe as soon as it's over, it just automatically processes on YouTube, and then you can rewatch it as much as you want. Greetings. My biggest problem is I never know when actually, I think I can click these. Oh, amazing. So I'm trying out a streaming technology called StreamYard. Shout out to StreamYard. Very impressed so far. They've worked really well. So my biggest problem is I never know when I should actually use SSR, SSG, or ISR. And I've got to say that it's very difficult because unfortunately, like a lot of things in programming, like it depends, because you can do multiple things the right way, right? Like the best way that I like to look at it is you have to understand what you're trying to measure. So for example, the Vercel dashboard, this is like an actual real world use case that we can talk about. We used to be server rendering that page, right? And we were tracking performance metrics, these core web vitals on this page. And we noticed that the time to first byte was higher than what we liked because, as I mentioned before, like we were making a lot of API calls and that request was blocking on the page. So the reason we switched to the static shell, the skeleton on the server, pre-rendered, and then SWR and client-side fetching after was not only for a better user experience, but then to improve some of those core web vitals, which in turn led to a better user experience. And just a quick little side note on core web vitals, starting next year, Google is actually using core web vitals to help influence PageRank. So it's really important that, not only do you have performance sites for just having a good application and a good user experience, but it's actually going to affect SEO now. So it's definitely something to consider, and check out Next.js Analytics if you are more curious in that. React Query versus SWR with Next.js. So if you've never heard of these, basically SWR, React Query, and Apollo are all very similar. Apollo has a little bit of extra stuff, but they get compared a lot of the time. And basically they provide data hooks, React hooks, that allow you to fetch data from some external source, right? They're pretty feature complete. Like they almost all do the same thing. And I don't think you can go wrong using either one of them. Really, the only difference between React Query and SWR that I'm well aware of is that React Query has a couple extra features that SWR doesn't, but then SWR has a smaller bundle size. So it's really, what do you care about? Do you need to use those extra features that React Query has? I think React Query might also have like dev tools. Somebody call me out if I'm wrong on that. But do you need that, or do you want a smaller bundle size with using SWR? So that's kind of my take on it. Feel free to chime in if anybody else disagrees. How are the performance of getStaticProps with millions of pages? I'm really glad you asked, because this is something that we considered a lot when we were working on this feature, which predates me being at Vercel, actually. So shout out to the Next.js team. They did an amazing job on this. We actually tested this with our demo using Twitter as a data source, which means there's millions of different tweets that you could have, and it works great. And our underlying infrastructure handles that really well on Vercel, but you could also do this on other data providers if you wanted to as well. So we've seen that incremental static regeneration scales really well, and some of our customers at Vercel are using this in production and really enjoy using it too. What else do we have here? How to have a loading animation on data fetching. So I believe what you're referencing is like, how do you have that skeleton state? And really what you can do is, I'll throw out two different things because this kind of depends on your implementation, right? Like the way the skeleton works on that Vercel dashboard that I talked about, you get to use SWR to provide you the logic to determine if you're in the loading state. And because of that, you can use, whatever CSS you want, whether that's vanilla CSS or Sass or a CSS framework or some like component library. Maybe you have Bootstrap or Material UI or Chakra UI, whatever you want to use. Actually, shout out to Chakra UI because they have a skeleton component that's really cool. So check that out if you haven't. And then you can use that to show like a loading spinner or a skeleton state for your page. Let's see. Why should I use SSR if ISR refreshes automatically for new data and it's non-blocking? Is SSR bad practice? So the way that I like to think about this is probably one of the most tricky parts for me, is because they share a lot of the same benefit, especially if you're doing ISR with a fallback of blocking, because that effectively is server rendering, right? Like it's waiting, it's a blocking request until that page finishes. The difference between those two, in my opinion, is that you have a little bit more flexibility with server-side rendering to handle a couple edge cases that you wouldn't be able to do. Like one of them I think of is multi-tenancy or like multi-domain applications. So if you're trying to build a platform that has, a bunch of different subdomains for, all the different users of your application, you want to check what those are based on some request headers or some other headers, basically, and then, serve up different markup to your users. That's one example. But in general, I just say that server-side rendering has a little bit more flexibility, especially as you get into like the A/B testing world and the personalization cases. Let's see. Basically, if you need to run server. Already talked about that one. What do we got here? If you want to render some dynamic data, for example, a blog comments as they come in on a statically generated blog, so that visitors can add their comments to the blog post and see it immediately. So one of the interesting things, there's a couple different ways that you can handle this, but one of the interesting things you can do with SWR is there's a mutate prop. So let's say you have a form on your blog where people can input comments. And when you hit post or you hit submit on that form, right, it's going to make a call to some API or some database to save off that comment. Then you can use this mutate prop with SWR or other data fetching libraries that allows you to update that cache on the client side to give you what we call optimistic UI, right? So it makes it seem as if it was instant. It updates that cache and you see that reflect instantly, while in the background, it's actually going to your database or going to your API and actually storing off that information. So that's one way you could do it. React Query has some decent dev tools. Thank you for who said that. I haven't tried them out yet, but I'm sure that's probably very beneficial. Yeah, check out the SWR examples. They have a loading state for sure. How would you handle authentication if you combine different rendering strategies? So great question. I have a blog post on this that I'm working to get into the actual Next.js documentation, but there's really two different types of authentication when you think about these patterns, right? You can do static generation with authentication, or you can do server-side rendering. And with static generation, if we even look back at that Vercel example that I showed, right? The initial markup that's shown, we don't know which user is there. So when the client-side JavaScript loads and when we make those API calls, we're fetching information about that user. And there's a little trick we can do here so that you avoid that flash of unauthenticated content. When you log in, you can set some cookie, and you can set a cookie that says that this user's logged in, such that when you load your page, you can actually use next head component to use the head tag and check, just using vanilla JavaScript, if that cookie exists. If that cookie doesn't exist, then you can redirect before you wait for the rest of your JavaScript to load. So then it prevents that like loading shell from showing, and then it redirects back to your login page, which is like not a great user experience. So that's a little tip if you want to do the static generation version. But then there's also server-side rendering, which again, I think just provides a little bit more flexibility. So for some people who are building like an internal application, right, they might just want to throw everything behind this like protected server-side rendered route, because the only people who are going to be visiting this are internal employees. And, we don't want to mess with the code for doing like a loading state or a fallback state. Like you only go here if you're authorized to be here. Let's see. Does ISR always rebuild even if the external data is the same? Yes, it does. So like if after those 60 seconds had passed, it's still going to go out and fetch data, and because that content is stale, and update the cache with that new data. But if it's the same, I mean, it doesn't really matter because it's just updating that data, which is why you have the ability to kind of specify what time range makes the most sense for you. Like maybe you want it really low, like 30 seconds, or maybe, maybe your page doesn't change but once a week, and you just don't want to, like you rarely ever rebuild, right? Because the thing to mention with that too is like, if you rebuilt your entire application, then they would all get updated because they would run at build time. Oh, that actually reminds me of another thing to talk about with static generation too, in combination with incremental static regeneration. That's kind of cool, which is, let's say that you have millions of pages, right? Think about that Twitter example I talked about, just millions of tweets, and you want to use ISR. What we've also seen people do is they want to keep their build times low. They want to have 3 2-minute build times, right? So at build time, they only statically generate a certain subset of the pages. So their build times are really fast and they can ship on their code. But then they use incremental static regeneration and any of those fallback methods to say, okay, but if somebody tries to access one of these routes that we didn't statically generate at build time, we still want it to work. Like this content still exists. We just made the trade-off that we're not going to slow down our builds for a blog post that's 10 years old that like maybe somebody visits every now and then. And you can achieve that using incremental static regeneration. What's ISR just joined? Yeah, incremental static regeneration. I apologize for all the acronyms. I know there's like a million. Why is your dashboard incremental static regeneration and not client side rendered? I think this is this talking about my dashboard on my website? I'm not sure, because if it is, I actually am doing client side rendering with SWR there. And I think the reason why you would make like any data driven dashboard client side rendered instead of ISR is because you probably want that data to be fresh immediately. You're just trying to prevent the slow time to first byte of doing server-side rendering. Let's see. Yeah, I think that this comment really nails it, which is when you have access to that request object and get server-side props, you get to do things like multi-tenancy or multi-domain applications. Use reducer and context API is a great way to have global state. Yeah, this is kind of maybe this is like a tangent, but this is my philosophy on state management. Most of the time with React, a combination of React context and like a use reducer hook will probably suffice for most global application state that you have. And it's important to note there's multiple types of state in applications. Like you have global application state, like is dark mode on, or is my navigation bar open, or like what's the current search value? And then you also have data fetching state. So when you think back, like a lot of the functionality that we used Redux for, and that people still use Redux for in a lot of cases, was to manage that data fetching state, like call some API and cache the value. So those are kind of two separate things. And I use like an SWR for the data fetching state, and then I'll just use React context for the global application state. Now, there's a big caveat here because like this works for a lot of applications. But if you reach a certain scale or you're doing something very specific, like let's say you're trying to rebuild Figma, and there's a lot of complex pieces here, a lot of like interdependencies that care about each other's state, then you probably want to dip in and use an external state management library. Let's see. Does Vercel and Next.js API routes distribute cache requests like a CDN? Yeah, so with Next.js and with Vercel, when you deploy, your static content is propagated to the global edge network. So it's available at all of those different edges. And then for API routes too, depending on the plan you're on, you can have those functions available at every single edge as well. Let's see. I think I might have missed this one, but somebody might have brought up Next.auth, and I just want to give a shout out to that library. It's really, really good. Just makes it easier to do OAuth if you need to talk to like Facebook login or Google login or et cetera, but still kind of give you the flexibility to have something that's open source and that you can kind of twist to your needs. So shout out to that library. How do you have protected routes or private routes? So for example, if you're doing server-side rendering, in there, you're probably fetching some information about a user. And there's a couple examples in the Next.js GitHub/examples folder, like for example, the auth0 one. If you fetch your user, or you try to fetch your user, right, and you don't get a user back, then you're able to do a redirect inside of your get server-side props and say, okay, there's no user, let's send this person back to the login page. Let's see. I am currently using, I just really love how you can like click on these and make them show up. Super nice. I'm currently using an image optimization API for an e-commerce site with product images. Will the new image optimization component in Next.10 cover this? Absolutely. That's the perfect use case for this. And if you haven't checked out Next.js Commerce, I would check that out because it's so nextjs.org/commerce. That's a really good use case, just showing kind of how you can use all the latest features of Next.js 10, like image optimization and the image component, internationalization, all in like a real world e-commerce example. So if somebody wants to put that in the chat, super awesome. Highly recommend checking that out. But yeah, it'll work perfect for e-commerce. Let's see. Thoughts on Apollo client cache plus SSG plus SSR. If the client-side navigation is going to the server to get JSON, I'm assuming it can't make use of Apollo cache data. Let's see. So I don't know specifically about Apollo, but I would assume that it's similar to SWR in this case. Like I used to work with Apollo at a prior job, but like some of those memories and some of that knowledge is kind of faded from my mind. But I'm assuming it's pretty similar to SWR, where there's a section in the SWR documentation. It's called usage with Next.js. And what you can do is use the static site generation methods like getStaticPaths to fetch your information at build time or at request time if you're using ISR. And then when you pass those props to your component, you actually seed the cache with that data inside of use SWR. So like for an example, I fetch all my products, and comments is a better example. I fetch all the comments at build time. And then on the client side, I populate the cache in SWR with that initial data. And then I could say, all right, like every 5 seconds, poll for the newest comments using SWR. Or I could just use the functionality that's built in where like if you revalidate on a tab, so you go to a different browser tab and you come back, it will just automatically fetch the newest comments. Can ISR be used to generate content for dynamic routes? Yes, absolutely. So you could say inside of getStaticPaths that you want a revalidation period to determine, maybe you're putting out a ton of different comments or a ton of different products or blog posts or whatever. you can do the same strategy there where you can have it check and have a period of time where that content or those paths are stale and then go fetch the latest one. So they work pretty well together. Can you adjust the memory and time of serverless functions in the API routes folder on the Vercel platform? Yes, I believe there's an option to change the memory that you're using, but there are like platform limits. I don't believe you can change the amount of execution time unless you're on a paid plan. If you go to the vercel.com/docs and then there's a limits section under platform, it talks about what the different execution times are and the sizes are too. So I think there's like, a certain set of limits for your free tier, obviously, and then there's better limits if you pay money on a pro or enterprise tier. What do you think of Next? I think it's pronounced Urkel, right? Like URQL. I think they pronounce it Urkel. I think it's pretty cool. This is the library for like data fetching with GraphQL, if I remember right. It's like by Formidable Labs, I think. I'm pretty sure I've used this before on just like a demo project, and it was pretty nice. So I can't like give a glaring recommendation, but I think it was pretty cool. According to Wes Boss, there was some issue with the Apollo client-side cache. Oh, okay, good to know. Thank you for contributing there. I'm new to the Next.js ecosystem. Welcome, we're happy to have you. Can you talk a little about popular used combinations? Anything your heart can imagine. No, I would say, let's see. Personally, I've been using Datto CMS for a CMS for a couple different projects. We actually used that for Next.js conference, and that went pretty well. I was pretty impressed with Datto CMS, so shout out to them. In the Next.js GitHub, in the examples folder, there's like 10 different examples with CMSs, so you can pretty much pick and choose whichever one you want. That's like CMS, just backends in general. I think it's pretty agnostic. Like that's the thing that's nice about getStaticProps and the other data fetching methods I talked about today. It's like Next.js doesn't care where you get your data from. You're able to still use all that functionality, and you could be talking to a REST API or a GraphQL API or whatever you want. But I'll just like quickly shout out some things that I've used before that are pretty cool. Azura is really cool if you want like a super like low code, just give me a GraphQL API and I don't want to do anything with it. And then there's also a platform called nhost that's built on top of that you can check out. Prisma is really cool if you want to have basically like a TypeScript type safe access to your database, and it pairs really nicely with Next.js too. So if you go to Prisma, I think it's prisma.io/Next.js, there's a little bit more information there. That's like data access, deployment. Obviously Vercel, right? I love deploying on Vercel. Even before I worked here, I was a big advocate for Vercel. So it's a great option for your Next.js applications. State management, we already talked about that. Animations, I really like Framer Motion. Shout out to Framer Motion. Component libraries, I like Chakra UI. CSS frameworks, Tailwind CSS is awesome. I'm just like shouting out random libraries at this point, but hopefully that helps a little bit. Feel free to message me on Twitter at LeeRob with 3 E's if you have any questions about that. Happy to help. Is Next.js plus Firebase popular in community? Yes, I think Firebase is like sneaky in popularity. Like more people use Firebase than you realize because the user interface is so good. Like it's so easy to get set up with projects there that it's crazy. And shameless self-plug, but I have a course on Next.js and Firebase called React 2025. So if you go to react2025.com, you can find out more information there. How can I create a sitemap that includes dynamic? I love it. This has turned into just like a free-for-all on next questions. I love it. I'm here to answer any questions you have. How do I do a sitemap that has dynamic links? I've got some slugs on Firebase. I need to create a sitemap. So I can actually, what I might do is just like try to go back to my screen sharing, and I could just pull up examples as I'm talking about them too, so that it's a little less like hand wavy. and more like, oh, that's like actually how you do that. So let me do that. So in my repository, which is lerob/lerob.io, if you go into scripts, I have this generate sitemap. And this is a little script that I run at build time that's just a node script. And I mean, you don't need to use prettier, but basically I go and fetch all of the different pages inside of my application that aren't API or they aren't like the next specific ones. And then I just generate the sitemap dynamically through here. And then I write it to the file system. So if you have dynamic content, like you need to fetch from Firebase, this is just an asynchronous function. So you could just say like await, fetch posts from Firebase, and then you have that array that you can iterate over here. Where am I at? Could you explain? Hopefully that answered your question. Let me know if it didn't. Could you explain how to use getStaticPaths with getStaticProps? Or if it's too long to explain, where can I read about this? Yes, absolutely. If you want to read more about it, I highly recommend the data fetching section of the Next.js documentation. But I'm pretty sure there's a good example in here where it's like, getStaticPaths. It's pretty similar to the example that I showed above, where actually maybe this would be more helpful if I did show like a real example for you. Let me try to do that. I'll just go to my GitHub and let's see. Inside of this fast feedback repository, I'm pretty sure that I have a tangible example in here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. I got an example. Awesome. So for this page, this is like this embedded comments. So you see embedded comments on my site. This is actually where it's coming from. So in getStaticProps, and this is using Firebase. So this kind of like all ties everything together, right? So I'm getting the site ID and the route from the URL. I get all the feedback, and then I forward that feedback to the React component, as well as information about the site. So like you can pass as many props as you want here. And this has a very short revalidation period. And then getStaticPaths. So then for each site, right, I want to have a unique route. So I get all the different sites, I iterate over them, and then I return all of those different sites here. So hopefully that answers your question. Suppose I have an 18 megabyte photo. How much megabyte would load if I was using the next image component? Would all of it be lazy loaded? So the way this kind of works is, I think, yes, I still have this in my URL. So this is a great demo image component, image hyphen component Versala app, but it kind of shows what happens here, which is, let me just pull up the network tab and let me know if this needs to be bigger. Hopefully that's big enough. I'll do a hard refresh here and clear this out. And there is an image that's like below the fold that you can't see right now. And I scroll down and you see that in my network tab, the image, the request to fetch that image only comes in when it is available in viewport. So this uses a little bit of JavaScript magic to determine when that happens, so that you're not like loading tons of megabytes for your image when it's not even in the viewport. And then also too, if you look at this URL, right, you see that we proxy those images through _next/image. And we have some query parameters on there for like the width of the image and the quality that we want. So you get to specify that, but no, you won't load all those megabytes. That's the super awesome benefit of it, is that it makes the sizes much smaller, and it also serves them up in modern formats for your browser. So like since I'm in Chrome, you see that it's using WebP, which is going to give me way smaller file sizes. Back to the comments. Hey, Andre. Hey, Lee. I have been looking into Auth0 for making auth on my application, but I'm using Prisma for the rest of my data. How would you connect these things? Just curious. That's a really good question, and I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I'm sure there is a guide out there somewhere for this, but I don't know it off the top of my head. So sorry about that. What do you think of the monorepo architecture for Next.js and Vercel? I think this works great. And let's just do a shameless plug. But I just wrote a blog post on this if you want to learn more about it, called Incrementally Adopting Next.js. It's on the Next.js blog. And it talks a little bit about just, okay, so you're convinced, right? You've watched this video and you're like, I want to start using Next.js. This talks about a few different ways that you can do that, whether that's like a subpath in your application, a subdomain, and then down at the bottom here, it talks about using monorepos with Vercel so that you could have, you know, n number of different sites if you wanted to. Let's see. This is a great question that I don't know the answer to, but I would assume yes. So there is an AMP functionality is built into Next.js, and there's a few examples in the Next.js examples folder. If you check those out, I'm pretty sure it should work with style components because style components supports server-side rendering. So my assumption would be yes, but I can't speak with certainty on that. Thoughts on Next.js plus Firebase hosting? I haven't actually tried this, but I don't know if you can you host more than static sites there? I don't know if you can do like serverless functions. I know they have Firebase functions, but I don't know, like basically the output that Next provides, it allows you to configure with whatever CDN or whatever backend hosting provider that you want to use for how you want to handle those serverless functions. And I'm just not sure if there's like an adapter that Firebase has made so that you can easily deploy your Next site and then like the API routes automatically become Firebase functions. I know that I've seen people host like statically exported sites on Firebase, but I don't know that I've seen like a full Next start application using Firebase. Let's see. Is it possible to have access? I'll go back to this. Is it possible to have access to React context in client-side rendering or server-side rendering? So yes, you do have access to React context in client-side rendering. In server-side rendering, I don't think that you have access to it. I think it's only on the client side. Can I make requests and send session information and get server-side props? So you can make requests, yes, if you need to like fetch some data inside of there, just like you would in the other data fetching methods. And you can also set session information like as a cookie or in some other way, like for example, like with Next auth, it uses JWTs or JOTs, however you want to say that. But there's also a few examples in the Next.js GitHub /examples folder that show how to do it with cookie based. So you can check those out too. You can redirect Firebase hosting to a cloud function that runs Next.js, but it's bad, just used Vercel. I mean, I didn't say it. Any resources on integrating AWS SAM with Next.js? I'm not going to lie, I don't even know what this is. There's like a million AWS services, and I'm like just learning about all the popular ones now. I'm definitely behind on the AWS curve, but if somebody has more insight there in the chat, like feel free to answer that one. My Next.js project is complaining local storage is undefined. How do I solve it? So what you might be seeing here is that if you remember earlier, I talked about pre-rendering. I talked about when you pre-render on the server, things like local storage and the browser window object aren't available on the server. So you might have to check and see if that exists first before you're able to use it. So one example might be, shout out to Gabe, usehooks.com. I believe there is a use local storage hook in here, a custom React hook. And I think you can probably use the, oh, sorry, I'm not showing my screen. Yeah, usehooks.com. Shout out to Gabe. There's a use local storage hook in here that you can kind of copy paste. And I think you just might need to check here if window.local storage exists, because I think this is for, it's not wrote in the context of Next.js, it's just wrote for React. Yeah, that might help. Give that a shot. Let's see. Any thoughts about Next.js with CDN best practice? I'm not sure entirely what you're looking for here, so I'll just try to guess it as best as I can. But with your CDN, you want all of your assets to, like your immutable assets that are, like your images or your HTML markup, like if it's not going to change, you want to put a really long cache control header on there so that when people visit your site, those assets are cached. And you can do this in Next.js in a variety of different ways. But one that I think a lot of people don't realize is that on API routes and on like get server side props, you can do like res for the response dot set header and set different headers. And you can set cache control headers there too, which is really nice. So if I don't know that I have a good example of that, but let me see if I can find a good example of that, just to kind of like paint the picture of what I'm talking about. Setting a header inside of get server side props. I built an example of doing multiple domains on Next.js somewhere. Here we go. Share my screen. Okay, so this is on my GitHub, Next.js multiple domains. In index, down here at the bottom, I have this get server side props, and I'm able to set cache control headers based on this request. And I'm going to say, okay, the max age is a second, and it's stale after basically 60 seconds. That's one example. Let's see. Just in general, like any tutorials you would recommend, highly recommend nextjs.org/learn. This is just a really great tutorial that walks you through all the basics and helps you build a React application. I want to add more content here, so if you have suggestions for what you'd like to see on like more of an advanced tutorial, definitely let me know. Will CSS work with next image? Yes. I don't think you can pass a prop to it directly, but you could have a wrapper around that image component and then use selectors to select whatever you're trying to style. So yes. How do you use global state like Redux in Next.js? So I've mentioned this a couple times, but inside of the Next.js GitHub, oh, what am I doing? You can't do that. So inside of the Next.js GitHub, there's this examples folder, and there's quite a few different Redux examples in here. So Apollo and Redux, and then like Redux and whichever different other packages that you need to use with it. There's a few in here that should hopefully help you out. AWS SAM is the serverless framework. Interesting. I did not realize that. I haven't tried that out, so I can't speak with any certainty on that. Will ISR have more fine-grained controls in respect to regeneration? Right now we have a revalidation option. How do I force? Oh yeah, so the question is really, so like, how do I force a regeneration? One of the things that we are working on and exploring is how you could programmatically purge the cache. So through some kind of like API or webhook. That hasn't landed yet, but it's something that we're considering. Where do you recommend to store the tokens? In local storage? So probably not. I think in general, I'm assuming you're talking about like authentication tokens. I would recommend using an HTTP only header if you need to send the cookie, so that you can prevent from like any sort of malicious behavior. And if you use, there's actually this with iron session example in here is pretty solid because it uses a signed and encrypted cookie to store session data. So this is one option that has a pretty solid example. Check this out if you're interested in that. Let's see. You guys are killing it with the questions. Thank you all so much for being here, by the way. I really appreciate everybody joining live and just hanging out and chatting. I need to do this more. I really like doing live streams. They're a lot of fun. So many questions. Okay. Rewrite pass. Hi, can we rewrite paths of API functions on a Next.js project? For example, in the Next.js config file, API route to handler. I think I know what you're shooting for, and you should be able to do this with rewrites. So basically, like some request comes in, you have a source, and then you want to redirect it somewhere else. So give this a shot. I think that's what you're looking for. Yeah. So how do you pass data the user entered back to get server side props? You can't really pass it back, but you can persist it such that you can look it up inside get server side props. So Brian suggested using a cookie. So yeah, that's an option there. Any good course do you recommend to be a pro in Next.js? My recommendation for learning path is just start with nextjs.org/learn. And then I'll give a little shout out to Front End Masters. Scott has a course on Next.js, Scott Moss. This is a really great course too. So shout out to Scott. It's one to check out. Yeah. Wow, I'm not sharing my screen again. Oh, okay. Front End Masters, Scott Moss, Introduction to Next.js. This is also a really good course if you want more than what's in the nextjs.org/learn content. So it's another one to check out. Or you can check out mine. That's also an option. I don't want to plug my own. That seems a little too much. So I will plug Scott because he's awesome. Any opinions on Material UI? I think Material UI is like really popular in general because it's been used for so many different things. Like you're probably bound to find a component that works for what you're trying to build. But I don't know. In general, I like the developer experience of working with Chakra UI a little bit more. And I've found that it has pretty much every component that I would need. So if you haven't heard of Chakra UI, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Super great. It's got lots of great components. And I think earlier in this stream, I talked about the skeleton component if you were doing like client-side rendering. And this is super nice that it's just like included in the component library for you. So check that out. Here's a fun one. What style of guitar do you play? I have a Martin acoustic guitar that I've had for like 6 years, and it's great. Like I've dropped this thing a bunch and it still works. I have an electric guitar in my closet that's also pretty nice. It's just a Fender Strat. I don't play it as much just because I can't be like as loud with my guitar, so I play the acoustic more. But yeah, I love playing guitar. What would you recommend for auth between Firebase auth, Next.js auth, and auth0? It really depends on what you want to use for your backend and also the type of application that you're building. Like if you're building just kind of like a hobby project and you need to get something spun up really, really fast, and maybe you are more of a front end person, you don't have as much experience with the back end, like you can't beat the simplicity of Firebase. I really think it's super easy to use. Next auth is going to give you the most control over integrating with a bunch of different providers and being all open source. And then auth0 is similar in that regard, where you can like hook into any number of OAuth logins, but I don't know the specifics on its pricing tier. So like if you're trying to build a real project with it, I don't know at what point you start having to pay like the big bucks for it. So that's just something to consider. So it's like open source versus like a hosted solution, basically. Just talking about Tailwind. Yeah, I really do like Tailwind. I'd recommend checking it out. There's a few good examples in the Next.js examples folder, and then actually like tailwindcss.com, as well as a lot of the stuff that Adam and team have been doing, all uses Next.js. So if you want some good examples, the Tailwind website, I believe it's all open source, and you can check that out. And then there's also this really cool, I think it's play.tailwindcss.com. It's like an interactive editor where you can go in here and make changes, and it uses like the same, it uses the same editor. I think it's called Monaco that VS Code uses. So this is really cool if you want to just mess around and try out Tailwind if you've never used it before. What are your thoughts on ISR at the component level versus pages? Is that even a thing? That's a really good question, because I don't know that I explicitly said that, but it's worth calling out. So all of these data fetching methods like getStaticProps, getServerSideProps, getStaticPaths, these are all at a per page level, right? So if I have my about page and I have 20 different components on it, you can't use those like on the sub React components. It has to be at the top level page. So the general like framework and setup for that is you do your data fetching at the top level, and then you can forward that down through either a prop or React context or some other way to get those to your components. Yeah, shout out to the Tailwind CSS website. Is there a chat group for Next.js developers? There is. There's an official Discord server for Next.js, as well as a GitHub discussions if you want to ask content that is going to be like indexed by Google and easier to find. Yeah, I think that's actually the end of the questions. We just reached an hour. Sorry if I missed any of your questions. I know there was quite a few in the chat. I really appreciate you all joining here today and just talking about Next.js, data fetching, and any questions you have. If you have suggestions for what I should talk about or stream in the future, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining. It's been fun today. Have a great rest of your morning or evening, wherever you're at.